Good morning, everybody. And I want to thank the UN for inviting me to present on what is going on in Canada related to sustainable finance. So I was reflecting as I was putting these few minutes together, and I thought back to my early days when our parents instill in us and start to educate us. And one of the things that they instilled in me was that envy, that is the wish that you had something that someone else had, was wrong. It was a bad character trait. And I held on to that belief until June of 2017. And then I attended an event in Toronto where Nick Robbins, one of the co-chairs of the UN inquiry, along with representatives from the EU and China, spoke about the sustainable finance work that was going on in those regions. And I turned green with envy. It was the first time in my life that I had experienced envy, and it was a deep green. So you might ask why? Well, the why is because I was blown away with what was going on in other parts of the world. And although I'm a very proud Canadian and continue to be, I was disappointed with how little this dialogue had taken traction in Canada. So what did we do? Well, we brought together a small group of Canadian UNEP-FI members, and we called out to Eric Usher, the head of UNEP-FI, and to Nick Robbins and Jeremy McDaniels from the UN inquiry, and said, could you help us get started in Canada? How can we get this dialogue on sustainable finance beginning in our country? Our first success was engaging Catherine McKenna, who is our present Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, and she would be our champion. But where we were challenged was engaging our Minister of Finance. And as those in the room would know, it's always nice to have your Minister of Environment engaged, but if you don't have the Minister of Finance, you're only going to go so far. The other point I'd like to bring in, and I'm sure most of you know Mark Carney, who is the present Governor of the Bank of England, he was Canada's best export. He comes from Canada. He was the Bank of Governor for us until 2013. The reason I mentioned that is Minister McKenna, our Minister of the Environment, was able to bring Mark Carney, our Minister of Finance, Mr. Morneau, and herself together in April of 18. We were finally rewarded because what happened in April of 18 is these three folks convened CEOs of leading organizations in Canada, and they launched the expert panel on sustainable finance. That was a great start for us. So then what happened? Well, the expert panel is formed of 4 well-positioned Canadian. 2 of those organizations are actually representatives of Canada's UNEP-FI. The UNEP-FI self-formed group that I've spoke of has had 2 meetings with the expert panel before they released their interim report on October the 25th this year. And what the report provided was an overview of Canada's present state of finance. And also, and I'm going to quote from this, they said, the pace and scale in Canada is outstripped by many of our peers. And I think that's important because we recognize that we need to play a catch-up. The report also identified the need for further investigation on the transition to the low-carbon economy and also the need for climate disclosure. So the next step is that the panel will be taking roundtables across the country with different business groups and then presenting their final report to government in April of 19. So where do we go next? The UNEP-FI members will continue, along with the Responsible Investment Association in Canada, to work with the expert panel. We're hosting a meeting in early January to talk about our collective and yet individual response to that interim report, and also collectively as bankers, insurers, and investors, how can we support that expert panel in bringing recommendations forward to the government? So I'm just going to leave you with 5 learnings, and these are from my perspective. The first one is that envy can be good if channeled properly. And I'm sorry, Mom, you're up there somewhere in heaven, but envy does get you somewhere. The second is that learning for those who have gone before us. So learning from the folks at the UN inquiry in regions in the world, such as the EU and China, really does help us in Canada because they've started to pave the way. The third one is that collective action is always better than siloed action. We will have far more impact and success if we work together as businesses in what we refer to as that pre-competitive space. Fourth, we need more bold and courageous leaders in the world and in Canada. And this goes for government and it goes for business. Without that bold type of leadership, we're not going to be able to take the pace at the level that needs to be taken over the next number of years. And so I do call upon our leaders, both in government and business, to step up. Short-termism is out, long-termism is needed. And lastly, and certainly not least, and this will be my plug for the UN, there's so much we gain from being members. And if we in Canada had not had that link to Eric Usher and the UNEP-FI, we wouldn't have, in my point of view, been able to start the dialogue on sustainable finance. So I want to thank Eric, I want to thank Nick and Jeremy for working with our Canadian members of UNEP-FI to continue this dialogue, and I hope the next time we meet, we'll be able to give you the next iteration of our story. Thank you so much for letting me share.